The radar operator's hands trembled as he stared at the empty screen. It was the night of July 24th, 1943, and Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hoffmann sat in the dimly lit operations room of Stade Air Defense Station, 25 miles west of Hamburg. The circular green display before him, Germany's vaunted Würzburg radar, capable of detecting enemy aircraft at distances up to 40 miles, showed nothing but the familiar ground clutter and the rhythmic sweep of the beam. The British bomber stream had to be coming. Intelligence had been clear, yet his screen remained obstinately, impossibly blank. Then the windows rattled, not from wind, but from the percussion of bombs falling on Hamburg 15 miles to the east. Hoffmann's blood ran cold. The bombers were already overhead, hundreds of them, and he had seen nothing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Hoffmann couldn't know in that moment of professional horror was that he had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where the electromagnetic spectrum itself had become a battlefield, and where German technological confidence was about to be shattered by a remarkably simple yet devastating Allied innovation. The story of how the Luftwaffe's carefully constructed air defense system was rendered blind in a single night reveals not just a tactical surprise, but a fundamental shift in how modern war would be fought. It's a story of brilliant improvisation meeting rigid doctrine, of a defensive system so dependent on technology that its sudden failure created cascading catastrophe. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night, we must first understand what the Luftwaffe believed was impossible. By the summer of 1943, Germany's air defense network represented one of the most sophisticated integrated military systems ever created. At its heart sat the Kamm-Huber line, named after General Joseph Kamm-Huber, a carefully planned chain of radar stations, searchlight batteries, and fighter control centers stretching from Denmark to the Swiss border. The system was built on a foundation of German technological supremacy, a belief so deeply held that it bordered on religious conviction. The Würzburg radar stood as the crown jewel of this system. Operating at a wavelength of 53 centimeters and a frequency of 565 megahertz, it could track individual aircraft with remarkable precision. Each radar station fed data to a central operations room where colored lights on massive plotting tables tracked every enemy bomber's position, altitude, and heading. German night fighter pilots received continuous radio guidance, vectoring them directly to their targets. The system had been refined through 3 years of night battles over the Reich. It worked, and the Luftwaffe knew it worked. Luftwaffe Technical. Officers had considered the possibility of radar jamming. It wasn't an unknown concept. German forces themselves used Störsender jamming transmitters against British radar during the Channel Dash of February 1942, when the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau made their famous run through the English Channel. But those jammers were massive shipboard installations, requiring enormous power and generating heat that made them impractical for aircraft use. The physics seemed clear. To effectively jam a radar signal, you needed to overwhelm it with a more powerful transmission on the same frequency. No aircraft could carry a jammer powerful enough to blind German radar without consuming impossible amounts of electrical power and adding prohibitive weight. This calculation was correct. It was also completely beside the point. British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had approached the problem from an entirely different angle. They weren't trying to overpower German radar with brute force jamming. Instead, they asked a simpler question. What if you could make the radar operators unable to distinguish real targets from false ones? The answer came in strips of aluminum foil. Each strip measured exactly 27 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, precisely half the wavelength of German Würzburg radar. When dropped from aircraft, these metallized paper strips would flutter slowly to Earth, each one creating a radar reflection equivalent to a heavy bomber. Drop enough of them, and a radar screen would become a blizzard of false contacts, rendering the operators unable to identify genuine aircraft among the clutter. The British called it window. The concept was stunningly simple, almost crude compared to the sophisticated electronics of German radar. A crew member could toss bundles out through the bomber's flare chute. No complex electronics, no power requirements. Just aluminum foil, carefully cut to the right length, packaged in bundles, and dropped by the thousands. But here's what made window truly revolutionary. It exploited not a technical weakness in German radar, but a human one. The Würzburg could still function perfectly. Its transmitter still sent out pulses. Its receiver still detected reflections. The problem wasn't the machine. It was that the German operators could no longer interpret what the machine was telling them. 1,000 false echoes looked identical to real bombers. The technology had become useless not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well, detecting everything and therefore revealing nothing. The British had developed window by early 1942, more than a year before Hoffman's terrible night in July of 43. They didn't use it. Not because it didn't work, but because they feared German retaliation. If the RAF used window against German radar, the Luftwaffe would immediately understand the principle and could deploy it against British radar. Defending London and other cities. R.V. Jones, the British scientific intelligence officer, warned that we would be handing the Luftwaffe a weapon to use against our own cities. So window sat unused in British warehouses while bomber command crews died in increasing numbers. By the summer of 1943, the strategic calculus had shifted. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of sustained bombing campaigns against Britain. German aircraft production was redirected toward fighters for defense of the Reich. The threat of retaliation had diminished. Meanwhile, RAF losses over Germany remained catastrophic. Bomber Command was losing aircraft and crews at a rate that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. On some raids, loss rates exceeded 6%. At that rate, a crew's statistical chance of surviving a full tour of 30 operations was nearly zero. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command, finally received permission to use window. The target would be Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city and most important port. The operation was code-named Gomorrah, a name that would prove grimly prophetic. The night of July 24th began like dozens of previous raids for Pilot Officer Thomas Mitchell, a 23-year-old navigator with No. 460 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. His Halifax bomber, designated JD-231, lifted off from Binbrook at 22:45 hours, part of a stream of 791 aircraft heading toward Hamburg. Mitchell's crew had been briefed on window, but the full implications hadn't quite registered. They were told to throw bundles out every minute. Each bundle contained 2,000 strips. Simple enough. As they crossed the Dutch coast, Mitchell began his prescribed routine. Open bundle, toss contents down the flare chute, wait 60 seconds, repeat. The metallized strips caught the moonlight as they fluttered away into the darkness. It seemed almost absurd, dropping what looked like Christmas tinsel to protect them from the most advanced air defense system in the world. Below, in the Kammhuber line stations, confusion turned to chaos within minutes. Radar operators watched in disbelief as their screens filled with contacts. Not dozens, thousands. The bright green spots multiplied faster than any plotting table could track them. Some contacts moved at bomber speeds. Others drifted with the wind. Still others seemed to dance and shimmer across the screen. Hauptmann Wolfgang Falk, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced night fighter pilots with 56 kills to his credit, found himself vectored toward what ground control assured him was a bomber formation. His Bf-110's own radar showed multiple contacts. He closed on the nearest one. Nothing. Empty sky. Ground control directed him to another contact. Again, nothing. In his post-war memoir, Falk described the experience as flying blind while surrounded by ghosts. The carefully orchestrated dance between radar operators, fighter controllers, and night fighter pilots, refined over years of combat, fell apart completely. Controllers gave contradictory instructions, unsure which radar contacts represented real bombers. Fighters burned precious fuel chasing phantom targets. Some night fighter pilots, veterans of dozens of successful intercepts, didn't even attempt to engage. The system upon which they'd relied absolutely had suddenly become worse than useless. At Stade Station, Hoffman stared at his impossible screen and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Unable to identify genuine bombers among the thousands of false returns, he shut down his radar entirely. It was, he reasoned, better to report honestly that he had no information than to flood the system with meaningless data. Later investigation would show that dozens of radar operators made the same choice that night. The Kammhuber line, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist for the duration of the raid. Mitchell's Halifax reached Hamburg at 0103 hours. The city sprawled below, clearly visible in the moonlight and the growing glow of fires. Searchlights stabbed upward, but they swept randomly, unable to coordinate with radar. Flak batteries fired barrage patterns, filling predetermined boxes of sky with exploding shells, but without radar guidance to concentrate on specific targets. Mitchell's aircraft flew through the maelstrom untouched. Around him, the bomber stream carved through Hamburg's defenses with an ease that seemed almost dreamlike after months of lethal opposition. Of the 791 bombers that attacked Hamburg that night, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of just 1.5%. For Bomber Command, accustomed to losses of 5 to 7% on major raids, this seemed miraculous. For the Luftwaffe, it represented an absolute catastrophe. They had been rendered blind. But the true horror of Operation Gomorrah was only beginning. The RAF returned to Hamburg on the night of July 27th, again using window. This time the bombing created conditions that meteorologists had theorized but no one had ever witnessed. A firestorm. The concentrated incendiaries created a massive convective column that sucked in oxygen at ground level with hurricane force. Winds reached 150 miles per hour, feeding flames that consumed oxygen faster than people could breathe. Temperatures in the city center reached 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and boil the canals. Asphalt streets burst into flame. People seeking shelter in basements suffocated or were cremated where they stood. Hamburg police president reported finding shelters where thousands had taken refuge, the victims still sitting upright, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning before the flames reached them. Other bodies had been reduced to ash by the intense heat, leaving only shrunken remnants the size of children's dolls. Conservative estimates placed the death toll at 42,600 people, the majority killed during the July 27th firestorm. It remains one of the deadliest single bombing raids in history. For the Luftwaffe, the tactical implications became clear with grim speed. General Major Josef Schmid, commanding the Chutunsaza Fliegerkorps responsible for Reich defense, filed a report stating that the day on which the enemy makes full use of his jamming device is for us a black day for the German air defense. He was, if anything, understating the crisis. Every aspect of German air defense doctrine assumed radar detection. Without it, night fighters couldn't find bomber streams. Flak batteries couldn't predict altitude and heading. Searchlights couldn't coordinate their coverage. The entire integrated system collapsed into its component parts, each element operating blind. German technical officers scrambled to develop countermeasures. They tried modifying radar wavelengths, but window could be cut to different lengths. They attempted to train operators to distinguish genuine contacts from chaff based on movement patterns, but in practice this proved impossible when thousands of false contacts filled the screens. They deployed additional night fighters, hoping to compensate for reduced effectiveness with increased numbers, but this only increased losses as fighters collided with each other in the confusion or were shot down by their own flak. The most telling response came from General der Nachtjagd Josef Kammhuber himself. In a confidential report dated August 3, 1943, he admitted that the enemy has found the key to our entire defense system. This wasn't hyperbole. The Kammhuber line, with its carefully spaced radar stations and proceduralized fighter control, had been designed for a specific kind of warfare. Window had rendered that warfare obsolete overnight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What followed was a desperate period of improvisation. Unable to rely on radar vectoring, some night fighter pilots resorted to what they called wild sow, wild boar tactics. They would orbit over target cities, illuminated by fires and searchlights, and hunt bombers visually. This was aviation warfare from an earlier era, crude and dangerous, with night fighters frequently shot down by their own flak batteries who couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the chaos. The improvisation came at enormous cost. Luftwaffe night fighter losses, which had been relatively light through early 1943, suddenly spiked. In July alone, the month window was introduced. German night fighters lost 89 aircraft, more than double the losses of any previous month. Many of these weren't even shot down by bombers. They collided with each other while hunting, visually in crowded airspace, or were caught by their own flak, or simply became disoriented in the darkness and crashed. The careful radar-guided intercepts that had allowed pilots like Wolfgang Falk to accumulate impressive victory tallies gave way to desperate, chaotic melees where survival depended more on luck than skill. Major Hajo Hermann, who pioneered the Wheel de Sau tactics, later acknowledged their fundamental inadequacy. In his post-war interrogation, he stated that we were throwing away experienced crews to achieve results that wouldn't have been acceptable even in 1940. But there was no alternative. German industry couldn't produce radar sets immune to window. German scientists couldn't develop countermeasures fast enough. So the Luftwaffe reverted to methods that would have seemed outdated in the First World War. Pilots hunting by moonlight and firelight, hoping to spot the distinctive silhouette of a Lancaster or Halifax against the clouds. For individual Luftwaffe air crews, the introduction of window marked a profound psychological shift. Unteroffizier Ernst Müller, a radar operator with the 3 NJG-1, described the experience in a letter to his wife that was later captured and translated by British intelligence. Everything we trained for, everything we believed about our technical superiority, it all became meaningless in one night. We went from feeling like hunters to feeling like blind men in a forest. The British didn't need better technology. They just needed to make ours useless. This sense of helplessness pervaded the Reich Air Defense Forces. German radar operators had spent years perfecting their craft, learning to distinguish bomber formations from spurious returns, to estimate altitude from signal strength, to guide fighters with split-second precision. That expertise became worthless. A freshly trained operator staring at a screen full of window contacts was no less capable than a veteran with 3 years' experience. Both were equally blind. The Luftwaffe attempted to maintain morale through propaganda that emphasized German resilience and improvisation. Luftwaffe magazine ran articles praising Wildsow pilots as modern knights, engaging the enemy in pure aerial combat without technological crutches. But the pilots themselves knew the truth. They were dying at increasing rates to achieve minimal results. Bomber Command's loss rates, which had exceeded 6% on some pre-window raids, dropped to below 3% by autumn of 1943. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Window had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. German military leadership recognized this immediately. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote in his memoirs that he considered the Hamburg raids a turning point in our confidence in our technical supremacy. This is a remarkable admission from a man who had witnessed the failure of German armies at Stalingrad and the destruction of the Afrika Korps. The defeat of German radar by aluminum foil strips represented something more profound than a tactical setback. It challenged the technological narrative upon which the Reich had built its military doctrine. That narrative held that German engineering superiority would inevitably triumph over Allied numerical advantages. The Tiger tank would dominate through superior design. The U-boat would win the Atlantic through better technology. The Würzburg radar would defend the Reich through precision and reliability. Window shattered this illusion with brutal efficiency. The Allies didn't need superior technology. They just needed to think differently about the problem. British scientific intelligence had understood something German engineers initially missed. In electronic warfare, complexity creates vulnerability. The more sophisticated a system, the more potential failure points it possesses. German radar was a marvel of engineering, but that very sophistication made it brittle. It required clear signals, clean discrimination between targets, and operators who could trust their displays. Introduce sufficient noise into the system, and the entire elaborate structure collapsed. The German response revealed how deeply this lesson cut. Rather than attempting to match British innovation with German engineering elegance, Luftwaffe technical officers began pursuing increasingly desperate measures. They experimented with infrared detection systems that proved too short-ranged to be useful. They deployed acoustic detectors that couldn't distinguish bomber engines from ground noise. They even attempted to train night fighters to hunt by moonlight alone, a tactic that would have been familiar to pilots from 1918. Oberst Victor von Lossberg, who commanded Nachtjagdgeschwader 3, described the period following Window's introduction as a complete reversal of our operational philosophy. Before Window, night fighter operations followed precise protocols: radar detection, fighter vectoring, intercept, attack. Each step flowed logically from the previous one. After Window, operations became exercises in controlled chaos. Fighters launched with only approximate locations of bomber streams. They orbited target areas, hoping for visual contact. They relied on luck and instinct rather than systematic procedure. Von Lossberg noted bitterly that we had become less capable than the British night fighters of 1940, and we were supposed to be the ones with superior technology. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was equally profound. The Kamm-Huber line had been extensively publicized through newspapers and radio broadcasts. German civilians were told their cities were protected by an impenetrable radar shield, guided by the finest scientists and operated by skilled technicians. The Hamburg firestorm destroyed that confidence. If radar couldn't protect Germany's second-largest city, what city was safe? Goebbels' propaganda ministry scrambled to control the narrative. They initially claimed Hamburg had been destroyed by a massive British effort that couldn't be sustained. More than 2,000 bombers, they falsely reported, had attacked the city. When evidence contradicted this, they shifted to emphasizing German resilience and reconstruction efforts. What they couldn't acknowledge publicly was the truth. 791 British bombers, using strips of aluminum foil, had rendered Germany's air defense system obsolete. The industrial and military consequences cascaded through the German war effort. Aircraft production, already struggling to meet demands on multiple fronts, had to prioritize defensive fighters over bombers and ground attack aircraft. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war as an offensive force designed to support rapid ground advances, transformed into a defensive force trying desperately to protect German cities and industry. This shift absorbed resources, aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, that could have supported operations in Russia or the Mediterranean. Moreover, the need to develop radar countermeasures diverted scientific talent and industrial capacity from other critical projects. German engineers who might have improved submarine detection systems or enhanced tank optics instead worked frantically on radar modifications that the British could counter with simple changes to windows dimensions. It was a technological arms race that Germany couldn't win because the British held the fundamental advantage. It's easier to jam a signal than to make that signal unjammable. By September of 1943, 2 months after Windows' introduction, Luftwaffe fighter losses in defense of the Reich exceeded 200 aircraft per month. Bomber Command's losses had stabilized at around 3 to 4%, still significant, but sustainable. The ratio had inverted. Before Window, German night fighters achieved favorable exchange rates, destroying more bombers than they lost fighters. After Window, Bomber Command could sustain its offensive indefinitely, while German fighter losses mounted toward unsustainable levels. Individual stories from this period illuminate the broader strategic shift. Lieutenant Hans Krause, a 22-year-old pilot with NJG-5, had scored 11 confirmed kills between January and July of 1943, using standard radar-guided intercept procedures. After Windows' introduction, he scored only 2 more kills in 5 months of intense operations before being shot down over Brunswick in December. His experience was typical. Experienced pilots who had accumulated impressive victory tallies found their skills suddenly devalued. The careful training in radar interpretation, intercept geometry, and coordinated attacks became less relevant than basic airmanship and luck. The training pipeline for new pilots also collapsed under Windows' impact. German night fighter training had emphasized radar use and systematic intercept procedures, skills that required months to develop. But with radar largely useless, new pilots needed different skills: visual tracking, intuitive gunnery, the ability to operate independently in chaotic environments. The training establishment couldn't adapt quickly enough. Young pilots arrived at operational units prepared to fight the war of 1942, not the war of late 1943. Oberst Günther Radusch, who oversaw night fighter training at Schleißheim, filed a report in October 1943 stating that "we are training men for a war that no longer exists." He requested authorization to completely revise the curriculum, eliminating much of the radar training in favor of visual combat techniques. His request was approved, but implementation took months during which inadequately prepared pilots died in combat or training accidents at horrific rates. The Luftwaffe did achieve some tactical adaptations. They developed Naxos Z, a device that detected emissions from British H-2S ground mapping radar, allowing German fighters to home in on bombers using their own navigation equipment. They modified some aircraft with Schrager music, upward-firing cannons that allowed fighters to attack bombers from below, in their blind spot, without exposing themselves to defensive turret fire. These innovations achieved modest success, but they couldn't compensate for the fundamental loss of radar effectiveness. The most effective German counter to window proved to be the simplest: more fighters operating in larger numbers. If individual intercept rates dropped from 40% to 10%, then quadrupling the number of fighters could theoretically maintain the same overall kill rate. But this solution created new problems. Germany didn't have unlimited pilot training capacity, fuel reserves, or industrial output. Every additional fighter defending Berlin was one fewer fighter supporting ground forces in Russia or Italy. The strategic bombing campaign was succeeding not by destroying German industry directly, but by forcing Germany to consume vast resources simply defending itself. By early 1944, the pattern had become clear. Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force could strike targets throughout Germany with acceptable loss rates. German fighter defenses could achieve local successes, particularly during daylight raids by unescorted American bombers, but couldn't prevent sustained strategic bombing. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 further tilted the balance. German day fighters now faced not just bombers, but escort fighters specifically designed to destroy them. The cumulative effect on German war production was devastating. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, synthetic oil refineries in the Ruhr, aircraft factories around Leipzig, all suffered repeated attacks that German defenses couldn't prevent. Speer's ministry performed miracles of improvisation, dispersing production and reconstructing damaged facilities, but the relentless pressure never ceased. By mid-1944, German aircraft production had actually increased substantially compared to 1943, but fuel shortages grounded much of the fighter force. The strategic bombing campaign had shifted from targeting aircraft factories to attacking the oil supply that made those aircraft operationally irrelevant. For the individual radar operators like Klaus Hoffmann, who watched their screens fill with false contacts on that July night in 1943, the war's final years brought a peculiar kind of professional despair. They continued manning their stations, tracking what contacts they could, providing what guidance remained possible. But they knew their expertise had been devalued, their careful training rendered largely obsolete by aluminum foil strips. Hoffmann survived the war and was interviewed by British intelligence officers in May of 1945. The transcript of that interview, declassified in 1972, reveals his lingering bewilderment at how completely window had undermined German air defense. "We had the best radar in the world," he stated. "We could detect aircraft at ranges the British and Americans couldn't match. Our sets were more accurate, more reliable. And it didn't matter. They turned our own precision against us. Every improvement we made to our radar just made it more vulnerable to their jamming. The better our technology became at detecting aircraft, the better it became at detecting their aluminum strips." This observation cuts to the heart of why window proved so effective. German radar engineers had optimized their systems for maximum sensitivity and discrimination. They wanted to detect every aircraft, distinguish individual targets within formations, track multiple contacts simultaneously. These capabilities made German radar superior to early British systems in every measurable way. But they also made German radar maximally vulnerable to deception. A system designed to see everything could be overwhelmed by feeding it too much to see. The British had stumbled onto a fundamental principle of electronic warfare. The sophistication of your opponent's technology can be weaponized against them. This principle would shape military thinking for the remainder of the 20th century. American forces employed similar tactics against Vietnamese air defenses in the 1960s. Israeli aircraft used chaff and electronic countermeasures against Syrian radar in 1982. The concept of using an opponent's technological strength as a vulnerability originated not in modern computer warfare, but in strips of aluminum foil dropped over Hamburg in 1943. The human cost of Windows' effectiveness is difficult to calculate precisely. Bomber Command lost approximately 55,000 aircrew killed during the entire war. Of those, roughly 38,000 died before Windows' introduction in July 1943, a period covering less than half the war's duration. The remaining 17,000 died over the war's final 2 years. This disparity reflects Windows' impact. Bomber loss rates dropped by roughly half after its introduction, meaning thousands of aircrews who would statistically have been shot down survived instead. The German civilian casualties tell a darker story. The Hamburg firestorm alone killed more than 42,000 people. Similar raids on other German cities, Dresden, Pforzheim, Darmstadt, killed tens of thousands more. These raids were possible because Windows had neutralized German air defenses, allowing concentrated attacks that created the conditions for firestorms. The aluminum strips that saved British aircrews enabled bombing that killed German civilians in numbers that remain controversial decades later. For Luftwaffe personnel, Windows' introduction marked the moment when defeat became inevitable. They might not have articulated it that way at the time. German forces would fight with desperation and skill for nearly 2 more years. But the psychological foundation of German resistance had been cracked. If British aluminum foil could defeat German radar, what other Allied innovations would prove unstoppable? If German technical superiority was an illusion, what advantage remained? Wolfgang Falk, the night fighter ace who spent that first window raid chasing phantom targets, later reflected that we lost the air war over Germany in July of 1943. We just didn't admit it for another 2 years. This assessment may be too absolute. German forces mounted effective defenses even after Windows' introduction, and Allied bombing remained a costly undertaking throughout the war. But Falk's essential point stands. The psychological and tactical balance shifted decisively that summer night when radar screens filled with false contacts. The technical aftermath of Windows extended far beyond the Second World War. Every modern military force now assumes that radar will be jammed, spoofed, or deceived by opponents. The multi-billion-dollar industry of electronic warfare, radar warning receivers, jamming pods, stealth technology, frequency-hopping radar, traces its origins to Windows. Military forces no longer design air defense systems that rely solely on radar, having learned the lesson German forces learned so painfully. Any sensor can be deceived, any technology countered. The strategic lesson proved equally durable. Windows demonstrated that innovation doesn't require matching your opponent's technical sophistication. Sometimes the most effective solution is the simplest one, not because simple is better in any absolute sense, but because simple solutions can exploit complex vulnerabilities that sophisticated countermeasures can't address. This principle influenced Cold War military thinking, where both sides worried that their elaborate weapon systems might be defeated by unexpected low-tech threats. For historians examining the strategic bombing campaign, Windows represents a clear inflection point. Before its introduction, the debate centered on whether Bomber Command could sustain loss rates high enough to threaten the campaign's viability. After Windows, the debate shifted to whether strategic bombing could achieve its objectives. Destruction of German industrial capacity and civilian morale, even with sustainable loss rates. The answer to that question remains contested, but Windows ensured the campaign could continue long enough to attempt it. The individual stories from that July night in 1943 remind us that technological warfare remains intensely human. Klaus Hoffmann, staring at his impossible radar screen. Thomas Mitchell tossing aluminum strips from his Halifax bomber, Wolfgang Falk chasing phantom contacts through empty sky. Each man was acting within the logical structure of his training and equipment, yet that night's events defied all their expectations. Technology had promised certainty. German radar would detect enemy aircraft. British bombers would be intercepted. The air defense system would function as designed. Instead, aluminum foil had injected uncertainty into a system built on precision, and that uncertainty proved more decisive than any amount of explosive tonnage. The Hamburg firestorm's survivors carried their own lessons forward. They had sheltered in supposedly secure basements, trusting that German air defenses would limit the severity of any attack. That trust was incinerated along with 42,000 of their neighbors. For Germans who lived through the bombing campaigns of 1944 and 45, Windows' introduction marked the moment when faith in German technological protection died. The propaganda about impenetrable defense networks gave way to grim acceptance that nowhere was truly safe. In his final report on the Hamburg raids, General Major Joseph Schmid wrote that the enemy has demonstrated that our entire defense concept can be invalidated by a weapon of the simplest construction, requiring no advanced technology or scientific expertise. This admission, from the officer commanding Reich Air Defense, captures the profound disillusionment window created within the Luftwaffe. All the careful engineering, all the sophisticated electronics, all the systematic procedures, undermined by strips of aluminum foil. The post-war interrogations of German radar personnel reveal a persistent theme: bewilderment that something so simple proved so effective. Würzburg radar operators, Freya detection system crews, fighter control officers, all expressed variations of the same sentiment. They had believed in German technological superiority, had trained extensively on equipment that represented the cutting edge of wartime electronics, and had watched their advantage disappear literally overnight. The psychological impact of that reversal shaped how they understood not just the war, but the relationship between technology and warfare itself. Modern military forces study Window as a classic case of asymmetric innovation. The British didn't need to develop better radar than Germany possessed. They didn't need to match German electronic sophistication. They just needed to understand the system well enough to identify its vulnerability, then exploit that vulnerability with the simplest possible countermeasure. This principle, that understanding your opponent's system can be more valuable than matching their capabilities, influences military procurement and doctrine to this day. The aluminum strips themselves have become historical artifacts. Museums display bundles of original Window, explaining how these innocuous-looking materials neutralized one of the war's most advanced defense systems. Visitors often express surprise at how crude the technology appears. There's no complex electronics, no sophisticated engineering, just metallized paper cut to precise lengths. Yet these strips killed the Kammhuber line as surely as bombs destroyed German cities. For Klaus Hoffmann, who lived until 1998, the memory of that July night remained vivid. In his final interviews, he described how his professional identity had been built around radar operation, how he'd taken pride in his skill at interpreting scope returns and guiding fighters to intercepts. Window had rendered that identity meaningless in an instant. I spent years learning to be excellent at something that stopped mattering overnight, he reflected. That's what war does. It makes your expertise obsolete without warning. That observation extends beyond one man's experience. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive doctrine, refined through years of combat, became obsolete the night Window filled German radar screens with false contacts. The thousands of personnel trained in radar operation, the millions of Reichsmarks invested in equipment, the elaborate command and control networks, all devalued by British innovation, that cost virtually nothing to implement. The asymmetry wasn't just tactical, it was economic and organizational. The strategic bombing campaign would continue for nearly 2 more years after Window's introduction. German forces would adapt, developing new tactics and countermeasures. Allied forces would introduce their own innovations: improved navigation systems, better bomb sights, larger bombs. The air war evolved continuously. But the fundamental balance established in July of 1943 persisted. Allied bombers could reach German targets with acceptable loss rates, and German defenses couldn't prevent it. Window had established that paradigm, and nothing that followed changed it. In the end, the story of Window transcends its tactical details. It's a story about how technological confidence becomes vulnerability, about how sophistication creates brittleness, about how the most devastating weapons aren't always the most complex. The Germans built a defensive system that represented the pinnacle of wartime electronics. The British defeated it with aluminum foil. That paradox contains lessons about innovation, adaptation, and the nature of technological competition that remain relevant 8 decades later. The night of July 24, 1943, Klaus Hoffmann watched his radar screen fill with impossible contacts and realized his war had fundamentally changed. He didn't know yet about the firestorm consuming Hamburg, didn't understand the full implications of what he was witnessing. But he knew, with the certainty of a professional watching his craft become obsolete, that everything had shifted. The invisible bombers had appeared, and they would keep appearing, raid after raid, until German cities burned and the Reich collapsed. That's what Window meant, ultimately. Not just a tactical innovation, but a revelation that German technological supremacy was an illusion, that Allied ingenuity could neutralize German sophistication, that the war's outcome would be determined not by who possessed the best technology, but by who could adapt most effectively when their technology failed. The aluminum strips are long since oxidized to dust. The radar screens are dark. The men who operated them are nearly all gone. But the lesson they learned that terrible night endures. In technological warfare, your greatest strength can become your fatal weakness, and victory belongs not to the most sophisticated, but to the most innovative. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.